I would now like to invite to the stage Cassandra Shi, who's a grant manager at the Ethereum Foundation, Jon Choi, R&D at the Ethereum Foundation, Chance Du, who's a project lead at Coefficient Protocol, Niraj Pant, who's a research lead at Polychain Capital, Yahya, who's a partner at 816Z, and Stephen Becker, who's head of risk at MakerDAO. Welcome.
All right, so we're here to talk about governance. And honestly, this is my first time moderate panel, so we're gonna have a lot of fun. So before we start, there are a lot of empty seats in the front row, so if anyone wants to move forward, please do so. So we can keep this more engaged.
For real though?
Yeah, for real.
There you go.
Yeah.
Let's take a survey. Who wants to move forward?
Hi, Jess. So before we start, how many of you heard about the DAO? How many of you know what a decentralized autonomous organization is? All right. How many of you were around when the DAO happened? Okay, there are some people. All right, cool. So we can use that as information to guide our conversation. So how about a little bit of background of everyone? So start with Ali, yeah.
Sure. So my name is Ali Yahya, and I'm a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, focusing exclusively on crypto projects.
My name is Niraj, and I work on the research team at Polychain.
My name is Chance Du. I'm a co-lead the two projects. One is a decentralized fund called CoefficientVC, also a decentralized governance protocol for crypto funds. It's called Coefficient Protocol.
Hi, Jon Choi, Ethereum Foundation.
Hi there, Stephen Becker, head of risk at MakerDAO.
Yeah, so we're with some really thoughtful experts on the governance topic. And governance is very important, but governance is always very hard. I think throughout human history, we haven't really figured out the perfect governance process. And same applies for the blockchain. We're still in the experiment age, where there's a lot of models, but there are also just a lot of ideas that are being explored. So definition, so what is governance? So in your word, what is governance and why is it important? What is blockchain governance?
Well, my sense is that the question of governance as it applies to crypto is basically just the other half of consensus. So we talk about consensus being the on-protocol thing that allows the participants in a protocol to arrive at consensus, for lack of a better word, of what the state of the distributed ledger is. The other half of that is the social consensus around the protocol that enables the community around it to decide what the protocol should be and how it should evolve. So that's how I think about the broad question of what governance is. And obviously the scope of that is very large, but maybe that's a starting point. We can take it from there.
Yeah, so I see governance similarly. I think there is a bunch of different types of users in a blockchain, in a network, different types of stakeholders. And governance is really what allows everyone to, I would say, interact and move the protocol forward. And guiding that correctly is how you build fairness and build transparency in a governance system.
I think it's very important that governance play this role in this blockchain system, because compared with traditional centralized companies, you are actually power controlled by very small set of people. Right now, blockchain actually empower the governance actually could control by the community, which I think make a huge difference with traditional economic. So I think that's why I think governance is so important, and also how to define it, what is governance? I mean, just explore this new kind of model that makes this maybe corporation or organization more efficient. I think it's definitely not just working this one way that right now how the company works. I think it's could be apply some like technology inside and also involved more large size of community involved and make it more efficient?
I think there are a lot of good answers already, but I think another way to think about governance is the process by which a group of people decide on change or not explicit rules. So one example is we have a set of rules that we have consensus on a given protocol. But if we want to, and everything's early, so you have to change something to upgrade the protocol. But the process in which you do that with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people would be kind of managed by governance. And the second option is, I think this comes up more in like a legal context, but if you have contract law, a lot of what you think about is if you say 10 things as rules, if you do things that are not listed, but you go against the spirit of the contract, then maybe you did something wrong. And right now we're talking about code, right? So I think that's like another concept around if something is not part of the code that gives you the governance, how do you decide on that as a community? So I think these are all kind of problems that we think about in governance.
To expand on John's point, especially with respect to legal frameworks, for me, governance is a framework where decisions and implementations take place surrounding things such as rules, procedures, but more importantly, obligations and rights. And in its essence, governance is the very defining characteristic of a business structure. And that business structure, to lead off what John was saying about the legality, gives us an opportunity to create new business structures from traditional to fully decentralized on this blockchain space. So for me specifically, that's where governance is, and that's the opportunity it gives us.
Yeah, totally. I think this group has the consensus that governance is about decision making, it's about changes and how the change decided. And there are certainly many, many ways in the blockchain space such like decisions are made and happen. So there are certain decisions for certain protocols that are made through on-chain code, like code is law, like it's like coded contracts on the blockchain itself. There are also like other ways to make those decision process and coordinations off-chain. So can we just expand on that and talk a little bit more about what are some of the ways those decisions are made and this governance process can happen?
I think it's going to be, I think a different stage. I was just talking with Ali. I think it's definitely right now, we cannot hard code everything into smart contracts to execute it. It's not going to work in the real world. I think in the transaction period, we do lead a lot of off-chain governance and correlate each other and make it efficient. And maybe have some like general, you can make some rules, very kind of simple rules to hard code in smart contracts, make it the whole workflow more like efficient. So, but I definitely think it's gonna kind of evolving all the time. So you have to based on the data input and based on practice, then you more kind of hard code more into the software, make it more and more efficient, and maybe along more all the time, then you could be more efficient and the intelligence of your smart contracts existence.
And I think it's worth clarifying to expand on what Chance is saying, that the word governance in this space is somewhat overloaded, and it really refers to three different kinds of activities. Mm-hmm. There's the governance of the company that's building a protocol or a crypto network. There's the governance of the code base, which is open source, and there are a lot of people who are able to contribute to that, and that's like a human level kind of process. And then there's also governance on chain, which is sort of an extension of the governance that happens off-chain, that happens around the code base, but is now codified to some extent into the protocol so as to make that process easier. So maybe that helps sort of clarify. Like the conversation is confusing if we don't even, like I think the word governance becomes meaningless when it no longer gets qualified and it no longer gets associated with what it means specifically with respect to those three things.
Yeah, so let's focus on the second type of governance, I think. Maybe the first is like the code changes on the protocol itself. So for some community, those code changes are carried out by a vote of token holders. And for some, those decisions are coordinated offline, like Bitcoin and Ethereum or Zcash is taking this more informal offline coordination process of making those changes. So maybe we can expand on that a little bit and just explain the rationality why, for example, Ethereum doesn't use like on-chain, like voting mechanism to make decisions on features and code.
Yeah, so I can talk about that a little bit. So in terms of on-chain governance and off-chain governance, I think I've talked to people that have been researching this area for longer than I have, and they usually have a history of having believed in one or the other at some point in time. So I think some of the things that drive the decision on whether they're a fan of on-chain or off-chain have to do with assumptions on human behavior around participation around political processes. Also around if you have representative government, when you choose somebody to vote on your behalf, is that efficient, or is there things that happen around corruption that you get to sell your votes, and does that actually go against the spirit of why you have representative government? And around defaults, if no one participates, what happens? Does a change go through? Does a change not go through? I think these are some of the drivers that make you think about on-chain versus off-chain governance. And I'm going to talk about this in my keynote a little bit, but I think same with economic policy. I think governance policy should really reflect the maturity of a project. So let's say you believe that your project is 80% done and that it has a small surface area to protect. I think in that case, you have to be very conservative. So defaults have to be more conservative. For Ethereum, I think that is a very ambitious project. You want to put a Turing-complete virtual machine on top of a transaction ledger. There's going to be a lot of things that need to change over time. So if you have an overly conservative governance process, that actually could be the thing that kills the project itself. So I think this is a very complex topic, so we can go into it more, but I think that's a little bit of my thoughts on on-chain versus off-chain.
Sure. So your basically argument is that because, so whether choosing, the governance model needs to also reflect the maturity of the project, because Ethereum right now is a very ambitious project. So you think choosing an off-chain governance model would allow Ethereum to move faster? Is that the core argument, or?
That's one of the ideas. I think that it is we can delve into all the reasons, but another reason to think about is I think there's a lot of smart contracts that I actually think I'm a big fan of an idea that if you can actually make it on-chain, so defaults are easier such that I can make a decision even without going to a conference or going to an event to voice my opinion, that's better. But the problem with I think Vitalik has actually thought about on-chain governance, right? And now he's a big proponent of off-chain governance for this one reason, that even if you have on-chain governance, even if you have all the APIs to vote yes or to submit a proposal, there is still human friction around that, right? So you have another meta-governance process around what's okay to put in as an EIP versus how do you think about delegating your votes if you don't want to vote. And yeah, so we can go into more detail.
Yeah, sure.
I think one related point is that there are a couple of building blocks that are very fundamental that are currently missing in the world of decentralized crypto networks that are very important in order for pure on-chain governance to work. Because right now, the only real tool that we have is monetary incentives as a way of encouraging the correct behavior. And it's a very coarse tool. If we had other things, if we had a mechanism for identity and a mechanism for reputation, such that capital is not the only thing at stake, but you also have reputation at stake, and there's also a layer of social consensus around the decisions that are made on chain, then the one-off prisoner dilemma style games become repeated prisoner dilemma style games, which are much easier to think about and are easier to solve. And so those, I think that such primitives are necessary before we can move to a world where a lot of the decisions end up happening in a completely decentralized, on-chain, codified way.
Yes, so blockchain definitely also gave us tools to, build those on-chain decision mechanisms that are. So blockchain is about coordination. It solves the coordination problem. I think in governance process, it's also about coordination. So certainly, blockchain is a really great tool. It can be leveraged in the right way to solve some of the coordination problems in the governance process. So, for example, in the Western democracy, a lot of times. There is this rationality where something called rational ignorance, where knowing a piece of information, the value added, it's not even worth the time and effort spent for someone to gaining this piece of information. So what that leads to in the voting process is that people either don't participate or people follow other people's cult of personality, where people just vote randomly, just because the time invested in making the thorough research to make the best informed decisions is really very high. And you see that in the DAO too. A lot of times people don't care, token holders don't care enough to vote to even reach the minimum quorum. So I guess my question is how can we design this governance process better to incentivize the right behavior using just like economics mechanism?
Well, just to answer that question, firstly, you have to consider it as an organic function that is iterative. You start with one sort of governance model, and you realize that through the distribution of your stakeholders, what they actually ultimately want. So you need a feedback mechanism that says, well, listen, we're going to punish you for this, or we're going to reward you for this. And in so, you eventually get to a very organic state where you customize your governance model for all your stakeholders, not just necessarily your governors, basically in that essence.
Yeah, I think there is a topic called liquid democracy. There's been talking a lot with how to kind of like design this voting mechanism within this governance model. But it's still too early. I know like right now Oregon is looking at them, and also there's a project called the Microservice. They're also looking at this. But it's kind of like complicated, but I think it's possible that apply in a small scale. But in large scale, probably very hard to design this whole ecosystem by using this liquid democracy stuff. But I think it really makes it like exciting to explore this kind of apply the democracy stuff on chain or on the software level. I think if once we figure out this, it's gonna really change in this how this world works eventually.
Yeah, and I think one problem that we see with voter turnout is a lot of the time the thing that is actually being voted on is not important to them. So like for most cases of governance, like if Ethereum is going to add Schnorr support, like obviously everyone is going to want that. It's not like a contentious thing. And often it's the contentious things that are rare, and we've only seen them a few times, which is why this is such a nascent time for governance and why we're trying these things. But I think that's one reason is a lot of times people want to delegate their vote according to maybe a foundation or to some group that they support, just because that's easier and doesn't require like active management.
But if like we have this on-chain voting mechanism where like token holders each represent one, I mean that's the basic. I think the worst way is you have like one token, one vote. But let's say like if we have like very crude implementation where like token holders each have one vote, and some are really voting just like following their money or like not even thinking about the issue they're voting on, that can cause some really bad consequences. They're very problematic. So like how do you design a better system than this, just one person, one vote?
Yeah, well, I think going back to the idea that you do need some mechanism for reputation, and you do need a mechanism to sort of expand upon the granularity of just one token, one vote is essential, because if the only lever in a system of governance is just the monetary incentive, then inevitably there will be many ways by which you can game that system and by which you can figure out a way to co-opt the system or co-opt the governance mechanism for your own purposes. And so I think that there has to be some social signal that's built into the governance mechanism in order for it to really work. And until that's possible, it makes sense to just have governance off-chain. Because off-chain governance can be inefficient because it requires maybe people have to come together and discuss what the solution should be. But it has the flexibility of being a human-level process that can be modified and that can be evolved over time, and that has the social dimension. People are more credible than other people based on the quality of their ideas or their track record in the community, and that's like an important signal that's missing in the world of just protocols.
Yeah, totally. So now we are diving into maybe the off-chain governance model. So for Ethereum, for example, like how is new changes being proposed? Can you just tell us maybe a little bit more about the EIP process? I think for people who are outside of the Ethereum community, that process is very opaque.
Sure. So I think it's pretty similar to even the processes on Bitcoin. You just have a GitHub repository where you can propose an Ethereum improvement proposal, and you just go into detail around what the motivations are, why this matters, who this impacts, what are the initial technical implementations, and what are the dependencies that this change would break or would need more work on. And then from there, you actually just have a pretty organic conversation online and in person about the impact. So it's pretty straightforward.
So is there any, like, what are the challenges in the current process? I think it requires a lot of coordination, right? So are there any new, like, different, like, new techniques that are being, like, looked into to make the coordination easier? For example, like signaling. Maybe it's not like on-chain governance, but we can use some sort of signaling mechanism before the decisions are being made to make the coordination easier.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. We actually do use mechanisms like carbon voting. So that's like a way for, if you own a token, you can signal to the community that, hey, I think that we should vote on A versus B. And that's not an on-chain thing, but you can give a little bit of support there. I think that we're touching on all the right topics here, right? Which is that if you go fully on-chain without the right infrastructure or the usage, then you have the problem of plutocracy, which is however much money you have is however much say you have in a network, and that's especially bad when you have like wealth concentration within like an early participation in a network. So I think where Ali talked about reputation and identity is the key question here. Like when you look at the U.S. kind of like wealth distribution, you have a progressive tax system, right? So if you make more money, not only do you pay more in dollars, but you pay a higher rate. So there is a sense of identity impacting the amount of like governing power that you have. So diminishing returns to money, but you can't. There are two ways of going about that in Ethereum or any kind of smart contract ecosystem. One is you hook into some sort of external source of identity. So you hook into a social security number or your Facebook or something else that says you are you. But I think there's a second line of identity, which I think is more exciting. This can be only possible if people are using crypto like day to day, right? But if you really look at like a mirror of yourself, like so for example, I took a car here, so that's a proof of activity. If I go have lunch at a restaurant that's in California, that's another proof of activity. So if you have enough activity in this ecosystem, you can actually piece together the different participation and activity that you have as a proxy for identity, and that could be maybe used for some sort of mechanism.
So a lot of people seem to think plutocracy is bad. Like for example, like yields. It's a pretty typical example of that. But there is also another side against this argument that it's only bad if you cannot exit easily. Like if you can exit the system really easily and withdraw your token, it's maybe not that bad. I see like argument that like plutocracy is bad in like nation states because people's switching cost from one country to another country is really high. But in the blockchain ecosystem, switching from one ecosystem to another may be kind of liquid. So maybe. Do you think, like in the blockchain world and in the real world, like the level of harm plutocracy can do is different, just because the switching cost is different?
That's an interesting point, but I actually don't agree with the premise. I think plutocracy is bad, and the reason why is, as there's more wealth inequality in the world, we'll begin to see that a small amount of people that hold a large and growing size of the monetary base of the economy will result in a worse world. Like meaning, so if you have a Palo Alto community, and if you have 5% of the homes that are empty, kind of like capital holding entities, that actually doesn't give back to the community. What you want is people that are participating in the neighborhood, artists, students, entrepreneurs, and people being there is what matters. So I think that's why I look to participation and activity, and we need to diminish the marginal value of money in impacting how much voice you have in society.
The one aspect there, though, that I would like to comment on is that I agree that plutocracy is a negative connotation, but only in a steady state. When everything has matured, when it's got to a point where it's clear what the landscape is, what the topology is, but it is a natural constraint when you start something. It's a natural constraint to understand how you want to move forward with representation and how you basically divine that representation, given the fact that you will have concentrated holdings, you will have cartels. And I think because the blockchain space is so new, that is one of the very important issues. So off-chain and on-chain, to get full representation from all stakeholders is really important to try to delve into that particular issue of plutocracy and get voices heard uniformly so that people know how to act.
If I could just respond quickly, I actually agree with that. And now we're talking about something that's bigger than blockchain governance, right? We're actually talking about the nature of capitalism. And there's well-known economists like Joseph Schumpeter who wrote a book about can capitalism survive. And I think a relevant, and I'm not saying that it can't, I'm just saying that there's a book called that, right? So I think that so look at Facebook, right? If capitalism didn't exist, Facebook wouldn't have had the incentives to create this like global, social graph where we get a lot of value out of it. But when you think about the nascent stages, the fact that I can use Facebook for 5 minutes a day makes me much happier because I can keep in touch with my friends. But when people are using Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp for 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day, I think that's a net negative for the world. So I think per your point, the maturity of a project or ecosystem is what should drive the governance characteristics.
Well, and relatedly, I think that the question of plutocracy also influences the related question of decentralization. So when people talk about decentralization, they mean decentralization of consensus, but they also mean decentralization of governance. And so if plutocracy is a mechanism via which the network is governed, then you're back to a centralized world where really a small group of individuals control the governance of the protocol. And at that point, you're back in the world that we exist in now, where you have like centralized platforms that are controlled by very few individuals, and there's no real advantage anymore to the vision of decentralization if that's the end state.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. So we talk about like governance and all that. I think we talk about the governance of the protocol level. So there's also like governance on applications, for example, like MakerDAO, for example. So you're not a base layer root chain, you're more like an application built on top of Ethereum. So how is Maker governed today? And what is the vision for giving the governance right back to your users and token holders? And what's the plan for the future?
Well, it's interesting. You have to sort of reverse engineer that a bit and say, well, what are we trying to achieve first, right? The Maker is basically facilitating economic growth on the blockchain, but more importantly, we are facilitating economic empowerment with the blockchain. And we want to do that with a decentralized stable coin. So the notion is really clear, decentralized. How are we going to do that? We need a vehicle. The vehicle is the DAO, right? So knowing that, you immediately know what sort of governance structure you need to put in place because you know who your stakeholders are. There are folks that produce DAI, there are folks that use DAI, there are people that actually support the entire system. So governance needs to answer to them. Governance needs to be able to translate their decisions into beneficial actions for those stakeholders. So the question is, how do we actually go about doing that? The first part, which is off-chain, is we create a forum, an education platform, and sort of a debate and resolution platform where we're saying, well, everybody get involved with the debate. Everyone, all stakeholders, because governance needs to hear what your voice is and what your points are. Because when they finally get to vote, you will hope that it will vote with those ideas in mind. I mean, that basically is one of the few ways you can work against a plutocratic system right in the beginning, where you know you're going to have cartels, you know you're going to have whales, you know you're going to have representation that might steer things a bit off. But if they get to hear all the stakeholders' point of view, maybe it will give them influence to move forward appropriately for the better of the whole system. On-chain, it is a case of saying, well, we need to record our resolution, and the way we do it is through a kind of a resolution vote. We call it governance vote, and that governance vote will pass, showing that everyone has resolved on a specific issue. And those issues may result in actual implementations on-chain, but that'll happen quarterly through what we call an executive vote. So we've split this whole function up into full representation in a forum and an education basis, and then on-chain with respect to a resolution and finally an execution on-chain. So the idea is to make sure that the debate is rigorous and scientific so that we can try and filter rhetoric and we can filter noise and we can filter any sort of partisanship. But at the same time, we want to make it very clear what it is that we ultimately want to do without any contention. It really isn't a case of binary, whether we can or not. It's really just a case of probability. Can we reduce the probability of contentiousness in the vote? Can we increase the probability of effectiveness in the system? So that, and it basically is an outline of our governance.
has there been anything you tried that you know would work? Like, so you talk about like, it's about educating the token holders, but talking about like, it's about like knowing what you want and reduce the contention. Like where are you, I guess, like how far along are you on this like future roadmap? I think because there's a lot of tools that needs to be built out. Maybe we're still very early because there's no identity solutions, because like token holders sometimes also needs to be educated and they need to just know and learn about the maker's value. I think how far along are you in this? And then what's the like next 3 years, 5 years looks like for you?
So I'm going to give you a really good economist answer. Well, it's going to be short term, where we're going to have this applied, but in the medium term, we hope to have the full function completely decentralized. The whole idea is to give decentralized governance the full tilt that it really deserves. And how we're going to get from here to there is a process, as I just mentioned, of education and creating those forums where you can really get these issues debated, but in the context of what is rigorous and what is scientific, and to move away from, as I said, the applicable rhetoric which you might find in this kind of situation.
So then my next question is, do you think those decentralized autonomous organizations, do you think there's any chance that to be abused by malicious actors? I think, Niraj, you may be a good really expert in answering this.
Could you repeat the question one more time?
Sorry, the question is, do you think like this decentralized autonomous organizations of the decision making, do you think there's any possibility this being abused by malicious actors?
Or misused.
Yeah, misused.
Yeah, there's potential just collusion possibilities whenever you do create a voting scheme like a DAO. It's really up to just having the vote come in a way that is mutually beneficial for everyone. So you can't have all functions of voting in a DAO, but there's certain ones that I think for the most part are deemed safe by the community. But eventually there are just attacks on networks that do mess with the governance. Things like a community might split over some specific decision, and usually splitting a community does hurt it quite significantly in terms of some ideological change.
But why is it bad though? Like if people in the community have different opinions and then they fork into different chains because they don't share the same ideology. Why is it bad? People all pursue what they want. In your case, I think it may not be that bad.
Yeah, I think there's certain issues can occur around just interoperability. One could argue that you're splitting up the community, and so now just progress might be slower on each specific network. It's harder for us to interact now than it used to be. There's a lot of usability and usability challenges primarily around something like that.
I mean, one similar argument is that increasing collaboration is always good. And so if you split a community, you reduce the extent to which collaboration happens between the members of each of the two communities. So having one United States as opposed to the North and the South is better because there's an increase of collaboration. It's more unified. So you can make a similar argument to crypto networks. If you can increase the scale of collaboration, if you can find a way to reach agreement, then ultimately that's just a better world to be in.
To reach agreement also means some members of the community may have to make a compromise, right? So let's see, if there's one issue, 70% people are all for it, 30% are against it. And then if we take somewhat a majority vote, and then this will get passed, but the other 30% is not going to be happy. So my question is, do you think it's better for this 30% of people kind of have to compromise but stay in this united community, or this 30% of people just part their way and start something new that they truly believe?
Yeah, and it ultimately comes down to the trade-off. Is the value that we get from collaborating greater than the value that we would get from having complete independence from one another? And I think that if you can have a constructive conversation about what each of the two parties want, then it's possible to come to consensus about some world where both parties are better off for staying within the community than they would be if they were to fork off into different sub-communities. But I think that the conversation aspect is very important. How do you enable two conflicting or two different communities to talk about what it is that they want and eventually come to some conclusion. And it may be that the right conclusion is for the community to split, but in the ideal case, that's a very nuclear event, and it's like the last resort.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be the only solution.
And if Ethereum split today, it certainly be a crisis for Maker. Because of the Maker's collateralized on Ethereum, yeah, I can definitely see it would be pretty destructive for a lot of applications building on top of it. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's why we make sure that we, building on some rock-solid foundations.
Yeah, totally. So, so I guess we still have 5 minutes here. Is there anything from the audience that you want to ask? We can leave like 5 minutes for Q&A. Oh, yeah.
So Microsoft just picked up GitHub and governments of a tremendous number of
Yeah.
Well, I could just yell, but so Microsoft picked up GitHub, and there's governance questions on a tremendous number of different projects right now. And I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel has any kind of low-hanging fruit recommendations that they'd like to just share, and maybe we can help a whole bunch of open source projects to try to figure out whether they're going to fork or not, whether they're going to try to stay on GitHub or move away from it. What are the pros and cons on that? I'm just interested, since you opened the field for questions.
So the GitHub technically doesn't matter to the crypto network. You could just like fork the code locally and then gain hash power to make that the canonical chain. But it does bring up an interesting point around like access and accessibility. Because the GitHub that maybe the core foundation of some network runs is the one that everyone knows and goes to. And so having the having right access to that is pretty powerful, I would say. There's a lot of attention on it. And so that is a little bit trickier. I think GitHub is just the largest kind of developer network of its kind, and it's hard to move off of. But eventually, alternatives will get created. Git's a protocol, so you can build your own version of GitHub and run it, and maybe crypto projects could go on there. Could be a possible scenario.
Oh, do we have any other questions from the audience? Okay, no? Okay, so we're going to wrap up here by asking everyone the last question, which is where do you think the future is regarding governance? Where do you think we're going regarding blockchain governance?
Do you want me to start off? Okay, cool. Governance, in my view, basically is the underlying characteristics of business structures. So from my perspective, the future is going to be a selection of business structures that folks are going to choose. Instead of an LLC or instead of a partnership, they're going to say, well, let's do a hybridized approach where we can package some of our legal or procedural requirements into tokens and split them off, which means that you're going to have this new menu of capital structures that will be available to investors, to VCs, and the likes. It's going to create a new paradigm in terms of legal persona for companies moving forward.
So I think that I believe in a lot of different blockchains coexisting. I think a lot of the 2017 narrative was around like competition and which one's better. But I think what I learned from people that have been around longer than me is that like this is really about the entire space coming together to make sure the entire space is useful. So I think with respect to governance, one of the things that might happen is you might have different environments where you're more conservative or aggressive about change assumptions. So you can work together to say, hey, for your mortgage, maybe you should go to a pretty conservative environment, but for an application like a messaging app, low value, quick iteration, maybe you should go to a more fast changing, upgradable path.
I think. Oh, it's works. Okay, I think the future of governance, I think it's gonna make more practical use, like why we create this kind of decentralized crypto fund protocol, governance protocol, because we truly think we should make those this opportunity happen in the blockchain accessible for like majority of people, not only for kind of like go back to what we are right now, where we are right now, like a small group of people like play those games. So I think definitely we have a lot of problems, definitely like the reputation protocol or identity or security around this governance issue. But I think as they technology and move forward, we definitely could see a lot of interesting governments come from different chains. Like I really like the MakerDAO they did before. They have these forums and even like the fund, like Polychain, they're trying to invest and have to post a post in the forum and to get approved. That's pretty interesting. It's never happens before in the traditional venture world. So I'm so excited about this kind of democratized this financial system. I think governance is a very important move to this. So I'm pretty bullish on the future of governance.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just a really exciting area of research and development that's happening. As we see new projects launch, new companies launch, there's a lot of different experiments around how we pay employees, along to how we vote on protocol updates. And I think the experiments. Sorry, go ahead.
Are there any new projects you're particularly excited about?
So we in the experiment of on-chain governance. I think Tezos has been kind of an early proponent of this concept of voting on chain for protocol updates. But I think even a system like MakerDAO is a great example of just a way to govern an economic system where there's not too much left to the actual user, to the what they think one way or another. It's more of a metric that you vote on. And I think that's a really cool step towards creating fairness and better governance in these blockchain systems.
So I think the question of governance has been a perennially difficult one for millennia, and I wouldn't expect the problem of governance to get any easier going forward. And so it is likely to be a very iterative process. There already is governance, and there's some combination of governance that happens off-chain with governance that happens on-chain. It is all one protocol. There's human-level protocols, and then there is computer code that also is a protocol. And over time, I think there will be a number of different experiments that kind of shed light on what effective strategies exist and what strategies are just simply not effective. And it's very exciting, I think, that it is now possible to run a lot of experiments that previously were impossible by creating these little microcosms that are kind of like mini societies in which we can experiment with new governance mechanisms and see whether they work or not. So I would expect progress in fields like game theory and economics, because now so many of the theories that previously people have expressed can now be put to the test, and we can get some experimental data as to whether or not they work.
Yeah, so governance can make, blockchain can make a political science a real science, because now you can measure, and you can test. And I'm very excited about that as well. So thanks everyone for being on this panel. We had a great time. I had a lot of fun talking to all of you. So, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.